Chapter 4 Shadowland. Danny weakened and went up for his milk and cookies at 4:15. He gobbled them down while looking out the window, then went in to kiss his mother, who was lying down. She suggested that he stay in and watch Sesame Street. The time would pass faster. Excuse me. But he shook his head firmly and went back to his place on the curb. Now it was 5 o'clock, and although he didn't have a watch and couldn't tell time too well yet anyway, he was aware of passing time. He was aware of passing time by the lengthening of the shadows and by the gold cast that now tinged the afternoon light. Turning the glider over in his hands, he sang under his breath, "Skip to my Lou, and I don't care. Skip to my Lou, and I don't care. My master's gone away. Lou, Lou, skip to my Lou." They had sung that song all together at the Jack and Jill nursery school he had gone to back in Stovington. He didn't go to nursery school out here because Daddy couldn't afford to send him anymore. He knew his mother and father worried about that, worried that it was adding to his loneliness, and even more deeply, unspoken between them, that Danny blamed them. But he didn't really want to go to that old Jack and Jill anymore. It was for babies. He wasn't quite a big kid yet, but he wasn't a baby anymore. Big kids went to the big school and got hot lunch. First grade. Next year. This year was someplace between being a baby and a real kid. It was alright. He did miss Scott and Andy, mostly Scott, but it was still alright. It seemed best to wait alone for whatever might happen next. He understood a great many things about his parents, and he knew that many times they didn't like his understandings, and many other times refused to believe them. But someday they would have to believe. He was content to wait. It was too bad they couldn't believe They couldn't believe more, though, especially at times like now. Mommy was lying on her bed in the apartment, just about crying, she was so worried about Daddy. Some of the things she was worried about were too grown up for Danny to understand. Vague things that had to do with security, with Daddy's self-image, feelings of guilt and anger, and the fear of what was to become of them. But the two main things on her mind right now were that Daddy had had a breakdown in the mountains, then why didn't he call? Or that Daddy had gone off to do the bad thing. Danny knew perfectly well what the bad thing was, since Scotty Aronson, who was 6 months older, um, had explained it to him. Scotty knew because his daddy did the bad thing too. Once, Scotty told him, his daddy had punched his mom right in the eye and knocked her down. Finally, Scotty's dad and mom had gotten a divorce over the bad thing. And when and when da- and when Danny had known him, Scotty lived with his mother and only saw his daddy on weekends. The greatest terror of Danny's life was divorce, a word that always appeared in his mind as a sign painted in red letters which were covered with hissing poisonous snakes. In divorce, your parents no longer live together. They had a tug of war over you in a court. Tennis court? Badminton court? Danny wasn't sure which or if it was some other. But Mommy and Daddy had played both tennis and badminton at Stovington, so he assumed it could be either. And you had to go with one of them, and you practically never saw the other. And the one you were with could marry somebody you didn't even know if the urge came on them. The most terrifying thing about divorce was that he had sensed the word, or concept, or whatever it was that came to him in his understandings, floating around in his own parents' head, sometimes diffuse and relatively distant, sometimes as thick and obscuring and frightening as thunderheads. I should have taken my hand out of my pocket. It had been that way after Daddy punished him for messing up the papers up in his study, and the doctor had to put his arm in a cast. That memory was already faded, but the memory of the divorce thoughts were clear and terrifying. It had mostly been around his mommy that time, and he had been in constant terror that she would pluck the word from her brain and drag it out of her mouth, making it real. Divorce. It was a constant undercurrent in their thoughts, one of the few he could always pick up, like the beat of simple music. But like a beat, the central thought formed only the spine of more complex thoughts, thoughts he could not as yet even begin to interpret. They came to him only as colors and moods. Mommy's divorce thoughts centered around what Daddy had done to his arm, and what had happened at Stovington when Daddy lost his job. That boy, that George Hatfield who made Daddy mad and put holes in the bug's feet. Daddy's divorce thoughts were more complex, colored dark violet and shot through with frightening veins of pure black. He seemed to think they would be better off if he left, that things would stop hurting. His daddy hurt almost all the time, mostly about the bad thing. Daddy could almost always pick that up too. Daddy's constant craving to go into a dark place and watch a colored TV and eat peanuts out of a bowl and do the bad thing until his brain would be quiet and leave him alone. But this afternoon his mother had no need to worry, and he wished he could go and tell her that. The bug had not broken down. Daddy was not off somewhere doing the bad thing. He was almost home now, putt-putting along the highway between Lyons and Boulder. For the moment his daddy wasn't even thinking about the bad thing. He was thinking about... Daddy looked furtively behind him at the kitchen window. Sometimes thinking very hard made something happen to him. It made things, real things, go away. And then he saw things that weren't there. Once, not long after they put the cast on his arm, this had happened at the supper table. They weren't talking much to each other then, but they were thinking. Oh yes. The thoughts of divorce hung over the kitchen table like a cloud full of black rain, pregnant, ready to burst. It was so bad he couldn't eat. The thought of eating with all that black divorce around him made him want to throw up. And because it had seemed desperately important, he had thrown himself fully into concentration, and something had happened. When he came back to real things, he was lying on the floor with beans and mashed potatoes in his lap, and his mommy was holding him and crying, and Daddy had been on the phone. He had been frightened, had tried to explain to them that there was nothing wrong, that this sometimes happened to him when he concentrated on understanding more than what normally came to him. He tried to explain about Tony, who they called his invisible playmate. His father had said, "He's having an hallucination. He seems okay, but I want the doctor to look at him anyway." After the doctor left, Mommy had made him promise never to do that again, to never scare them that way, and Danny had agreed. He was frightened himself because when he had concentrated, his mind had flown out to his daddy, and just for a moment, before Tony had appeared, far away as he always did, calling distantly, and the strange things that had blotted out their kitchen and the carved roast on the blue plate, for just a moment his own consciousness had plunged through his daddy's darkness to an incomprehensible word much more frightening than divorce, and that word was suicide. Danny had never come across it again in his daddy's mind, and he had certainly not gone looking for it. He didn't care if he never found out exactly what that word meant, but he did like to concentrate, because sometimes Tony would come. Not every time. Sometimes things just got woozy and swimmy for a minute, and then cleared. Most times, in fact. But at other times Tony would appear at the very limit of his vision, calling distantly and beckoning. It had happened twice since they moved to Boulder, and he remembered how surprised and pleased he had been to find Tony had followed him all the way from Vermont. So all his friends hadn't been left behind after all. The first time he had been out in the backyard and nothing much had happened. Just Tony beckoning in the darkness, and a few minutes later he had come back to real things with a few vague fragments of memory. like a jumbled dream. The second time, 2 weeks ago, had been more interesting. Tony beckoning, calling from 4 yards over, "Danny, come see." It seemed that he was getting up, and then falling into a deep hole like Alice in Wonderland. Danny had been in the basement of the apartment house, and Tony had been beside him, pointing into the shadows at the trunk his daddy carried all his important papers in, especially the play. "See," Tony had said in his distant musical voice, "it's under the stairs, right under the stairs. The movers put it right under the stairs." Danny had stepped forward to look more closely at this marvel, and then he was falling again. This time out of the backyard swing where he had been sitting all alone. He had gotten the wind knocked out of himself too. 3 or 4 days later his daddy had been stomping around, telling Mommy furiously that he had been all over the basement and the trunk wasn't there, and he was going to sue the movers who had left it somewhere between Vermont and Colorado. How was he supposed to finish the play if things like this kept cropping up? Danny said, "No, Daddy, it's under the stairs. The movers put it right under the stairs." Daddy had given him a strange look and had gone to see. The trunk had been there, just where Tony had shown him. Daddy had taken him aside, had sat him on his lap, and had asked Danny who let him down cellar. Had it been Tom from upstairs? The cellar was dangerous, Daddy said. That was why the landlord kept it locked. If someone was leaving it unlocked, Daddy wanted to know. He was glad to have his papers and his play, but it wouldn't be worth it to him, he said, if Danny fell down the stairs and broke his leg. Danny told his father earnestly that he hadn't been down in the cellar. That door was always locked. And Mommy agreed. Danny never went back in the dark hall, she said, because it was damp and dark and spidery. He didn't tell lies. "Then how did you know, Doc?" Daddy asked. "Tony showed me." His mother and father had exchanged a look over his head. This had happened before from time to time. Because it was frightening, they swept it quickly from their minds. But he knew they worried about Tony, Mommy especially, and he was careful about thinking the way that could make Tony come where she might see. But now he thought she was lying down, not moving about in the kitchen yet, and so he concentrated hard to see if he could understand what Daddy was thinking about. Oh, my neck. It's getting tired. His brow furrowed and his slightly grimy hands clenched into tight fists on his jeans. He didn't close his eyes. That wasn't necessary. But he squinched them down to slits and imagined Daddy's voice, Jack's voice, John Daniel Torrance's voice, deep and steady, sometimes quirking up with amusement, or deepening even more with anger, or just staying steady because he was thinking of, thinking about, thinking, thinking. Danny sighed quietly and his body slumped on the curb as if all the muscles had gone out of it. He was fully conscious. He saw the street and the girl and boy walking up the sidewalk on the other side holding hands because they were in love, so happy about the day and themselves together in the day. He saw autumn leaves blowing along the gutter, yellow cartwheels of irregular shape. He saw the house they were passing, and noticed how the roof was covered with shingles. "I guess it'll be no problem if the flashing's okay. Yeah, that'll be all right. That Watson. Christ, what a character. Wish there was a place for him in the play. I'll end up with the whole human race in if I don't watch it. Yeah, shingles. Are there nails out there? Oh, forgot to ask them. Well, they're simple to get. Sidewinder hardware store. Wasp. They'll be nesting this time of year. I want to get one of those bug bombs in case they're there when I rip the old shingles. New shingles. Old. Shingles. So that's what he was thinking about. He had gotten the job and was thinking about shingles. Then he didn't know who Watson was. but everything else seemed clear enough. And he might get to see a wasp nest, just as sure as his name was Danny. Danny. He looked up and there was Tony, far up the street, standing by a stop sign and waving. Danny, as always, felt a warm burst of pleasure at seeing his old friend, but this time he seemed to feel a prick of fear, too, as if Tony had come with some darkness hidden behind his back, a jar of wasps which, when released, would sting deeply. But there was no question of not going. He slumped further down on the curb, his hands sliding laxly from his thighs and dangling below the fork of his crotch. His chin sank onto his chest, and there was a dim, painless tug as part of him got up and ran after Tony into funneling darkness. Danny! Now the darkness was shot with swirling whiteness. A coughing, whooping sound and bending tortured shadows that resolved themselves into fir trees at night, being pushed by a screaming gale. Snow swirled and danced. Snow everywhere. Too deep, Tony said from the darkness, and there was a sadness in his voice that terrified Danny. Too deep to get out. Another shape looming, rearing, huge and rectangular, a sloping roof. Whiteness that was blurred in the stormy darkness. Many windows. A long building with a shingled roof. Some of the shingles were greener, newer. His daddy put them on, with nails from the Sidewinder hard store. Now the snow was covering the shingles. It was covering everything. A green witch light glowed into being on the front of the building, flickered, and became a giant grinning skull over two crossed bones. Poison, Tony said from the floating darkness. Poison. Other signs flickered past his eyes, some in green letters, some of them on boards stuck at leaning angles in the snowdrifts. No swimming. Danger. Live wires. This property condemned. High voltage. Third rail. Danger of death. Keep off. Keep out. No trespassing. Violators will be shot on sight. He understood none of them completely. He couldn't read, but got a sense of all, and a dreamy terror floated into the dark hollows of his body like light brown spores that would die in sunlight. They faded. Now he was in a room filled with strange furniture. Uh, Strange furniture, a room that was dark. Snow spattered against the windows like thrown sand. His mouth was dry, his eyes like hot marbles, his heart trife hammering in his chest. Outside there were hollow booming noises like a drip. Ah, shut the door. Yeah, I know, I heard him. Outside there was a hollow booming noise like a dreadful door being thrown wide open. Footfalls. Across the room was a mirror, and deep down in its silver bubble a single word appeared in green fire, and that word was red rum. The room faded. Another room, he knew, would know this one. An overturned chair, a broken window with snow swirling in. Already it had frosted the edge of the rug. The drapes had been pulled free and hung on their broken rod at an angle. A hollow cabinet lying on its face. More hollow booming noises, steady, rhythmic, horrible, smashing glass, approaching destruction. A hoarse voice, the voice of a madman, made the more terrible by its familiarity. See ya. See ya. Shut the door. Hey. Come out. Come out, you old shit. Take your medicine. Crash, crash, crash. Splintering wood. A bellow of rage and satisfaction. Red rum coming. Drifting across the room, pictures torn off the walls. A record player. Mommy's record player? Overturned on the floor. Her records, Greg, Handel, the Beatles, Art Funkel, Bach, Liszt, thrown everywhere, broken into jagged black pie wedges. A shaft of light coming from another room, the bathroom, harsh white light and a word flickering on and off in the medicine cabinet mirror like a red eye. Red rum, red rum, red rum. No, he whispered. No, Tony, please. And dangling over the white porcelain lip of the bathtub, a hand. Limp. A slow trickle of blood, red rum, trickling down one of the fingers, the third, dripping onto the tile from the carefully shaped nail. No. Oh no. Oh no. Oh please, Tony, you're scaring me. Red rum, red rum, red rum. Stop it, Tony, stop it. Fading. In the darkness the booming noises grew louder, louder still, echoing everywhere, all around. And now he was crouching in a dark hallway, crouched on a blue rug with a riot of twisting black shapes woven into his pile, listening to the booming noises approach. And now a shape turned the corner and began to come toward him, lurching, smelling of blood and doom. It had a mallet in one hand and it was swinging it, red rum, from side to side in vicious arcs, and slamming it into the walls, cutting the silk wallpaper, knocking out ghostly bursts of plaster dust. Come on and take your medicine. Take it like a man. The shape advancing on him, reeking of that sweet sour odor, gigantic. The mallet head cutting across the air like a wicked hissing whisper, and the great hollow boom as it crashed into the wall, sending the dust out in a puff you could smell, dry and itchy. Tiny red eyes glowed in the dark. The monster was upon him. It had discovered him, cowering here with a blank wall at his back, and the trapdoor in the ceiling was locked. Darkness, drifting. Tony, please take me back. Please, please. And he was back, sitting on the curb of Orifo Street, his shirt sticking damply to his back, his body bathed in sweat. In his ears he could still hear that huge contraptional booming sound and smell his own urine as he voided himself in the extremity of his terror. He could see that limp hand dangling over the edge of the tub, with blood running down one finger, the third, and that inexplicable word, so much more horrible than any of the others, red rum, and now sunshine, real things, except for Tony, now 6 blocks up and only a speck, standing on the corner, his face, his voice faint and high and sweet. Be careful, Doc. Then in the next instant Tony was gone, and Daddy's battered red bug was turning the corner and chattering up the street, farting blue smoke behind it. Danny was off the curb in a second, waving, jiving from one foot to the other, yelling, Daddy! Hey, Dad! Hi! Hi! His daddy swung the VW into the curb, killed the engine, and opened the door. Danny ran toward him and then froze, his eyes widening. His heart crawled up into the middle of his throat and then froze. Beside his daddy in the other front seat was a short-handled mallet, its head clogged with blood and hair. Then it was just a bag of groceries. Danny, you okay, Doc? Yeah, I'm okay. He went to his daddy and buried his face in Daddy's sheepskin lined denim jacket and hugged him tight, tight, tight. Jack hugged him back, slightly bewildered. Hey, you don't want to sit in the sun like that, Doc. You're dripping sweat. I guess I fell asleep a little. I love you, Daddy. I've been waiting. I love you too, Dan. I brought home some stuff. Think you're big enough to carry it upstairs? Sure am. Doc Torrance, the world's strongest man, Jack said and ruffled his hair, whose hobby is falling asleep on street corners. Then they were walking up to the door, and Mommy had come down to the porch to meet them, and he stood on the second step and watched them kiss. They were glad to see each other. Love came out of them the way love had come out of the boy.
No!
Don't do that. Shut the door. I see. Look, stop screaming.
Sorry.
Do you see what I have to deal with? First of all, before I continue, do you see what I have to deal with? I'm sorry. Um, they were glad to see each other. Love came out of them the way it come out of the boy and girl, walking up the street and holding hands. Danny was glad. The bag of groceries, just a bag of groceries, crackled in his arms. Everything was all right. Daddy was home. Mommy was loving him. There were no bad things, and not everything Tony showed him always happened. But fear had settled around his heart, deep and dreadful around his heart, and around that indecipherable word he had seen in his spirit's mirror. And that's where I'm going to end up for today. Things are just too hectic to continue as they are. So we'll start right back in chapter 5 whenever I get the chance. Hope you enjoyed so far, because you're going to love the rest.